My name is Robert Shaw. I'm the author of the book Architecture of Power, published by Cymroglyphics, and thank you very much to Watkins Books for inviting me to talk this evening. Architecture of Power is really the product of my fascination with the City of London, its history and its politics. The City of London is one of the most powerful institutions in the world, the engine and the creator of the British Empire, and very, very few people have heard of it, and its history has always fascinated me. Not least because so much of the official history, let's say, of London is unbelievable in a literal sense. There are all kinds of stories and myths that have been woven into the history of London. So it is very interesting to try and pick the myth apart from the history and the history apart from the myth. And I'd like to give an example of that now. For some reason, we're consistently told that London is Roman in origin, even though archaeology and other evidence clearly contradicts this. In 1993, for example, the foundations of a bridge were found near Vauxhall, and the timbers were dated to about 1500 BC. Besides this, there have been some incredibly beautiful finds, Bronze Age artifacts thrown into the Thames as offerings, and all of this long predates Rome. And it's interesting to note that the Romans themselves said that London wasn't a Roman town, at least initially. You can see here the quote from Tacitus saying that London, though not distinguished by the title of colony, was still a bustling urban centre, and not being a colony meant it wasn't a Roman town at that point. Here we get into a sort of silly syllogism that some historians like to employ, which is only the Romans really built towns, therefore anything that was there that was before the Romans wasn't a town, it was just a settlement. And this is sort of despite the fact that it's been described as a thriving centre of international trade. It was a thriving port, but it was just a settlement. This is, from my point of view, part of a larger prejudice on the part of some English historians to view Brythonic culture as backward and therefore not capable of achieving anything. This despite the fact that they defeated Julius Caesar twice. This imperial legacy of Rome, I think, is also bound up with London's later imperial ambitions of its own. So with imperial ambitions in mind, I'd like to turn now to the subject of my book Architecture of Power, which focuses on the churches built by Nicholas Hawksmoor, who was Christopher Wren's only pupil. And I'll begin just with a reading from the introduction of the book. The architect Nicholas Hawksmoor worked in London as the assistant to Christopher Wren in the aftermath of the Great Fire of London. My fascination with Hawksmoor's work is what led me to make some remarkable discoveries about this period. Every British child is taught about the 1666 Great Fire of London before we're old enough to question or think about it. This book demonstrates beyond reasonable doubt that the official version of these events is a lie, designed to cover up an embarrassing truth. Using witness statements from the parliamentary committee set up to investigate the fire, you'll be shown this era in a context we are never taught. This was part of a sometimes public, sometimes private battle for control of the country, fought between the Crown in the form of the Stuart monarchs and the City of London and the bankers who ran it. The city won this battle and became the birthplace for modern capitalism, and so begat the modern age. Science and technology, industrialised warfare and conquest all helped build the British Empire. This was all achieved for the enrichment of a small elite who ran the City of London. Today, the city remains the single most powerful institution on earth, all the more so because so few people know it exists, let alone what it is and what it has done. The sixth mass extinction event on earth we are currently experiencing, the destruction of nature and the debt enslavement of nearly every human on earth, can be traced back to the banks of the City of London. This is the story of how this process was unleashed on the world. The conflict between the city and the Crown that Hawksmoor was part of is comparable in some ways to what was quickly called Brexit in our own times. Two separate elites with different investments and worldviews were fighting for control of the country. So this isn't a good versus evil fairy story, it's a real history of the rivalry of two powerful groups fighting messily for control. In the fight between the aristocrats and bankers, the people were an afterthought. This 17th century struggle resulted in multiple wars known collectively today as the Civil Wars, that sort of culminated in the beheading of Charles I in 1649, then the restoration of his son as Charles II in 1660, and later the deposition of Charles II's brother James II in 1688 in what became known as the Glorious Revolution. The Glorious Revolution marked the complete victory of the city and the city faction over the crown and the royal faction. There was a popular rhyme in London in the early 18th century that went, "The lion and the unicorn fought for the crown, the lion beat the unicorn all over town." This very neatly summarises about 100 years of British politics, the tension between the lions of the city and the unicorn Stuart kings, first James I, then his son Charles I, and then his two sons Charles, and last by all means least Charles's younger brother James II. As the rhyme states, the lion beat the unicorn, which is hardly a surprise. Stuart notions of the monarchy were based on superstition and convention. The city is and was only ever a pragmatic body. It's worth keeping in mind that Charles II and James II, the last two Stuart kings, returned to rule a country that had rebelled against and executed their father. They had been routinely defeated and humiliated on the battlefield by the people they had later returned to reign over. For the ultra-status-conscious Stuarts, this is supremely awkward. These Stuart brothers believed they had a divine right to rule over their subjects. As man obeys God, that is, without question, so a subject should obey their king. From their point of view, the people who had humiliated them and beheaded their father had not just committed regicide, they had committed deicide and actually killed God on earth. This book puts forward the hypothesis that this was not something the Stuart brothers found it easy to forgive, and they plotted their revenge on a scale unimaginable to most sane people. The journey down this rabbit hole began for me with an urban legend about the work of an obscure architect, Nicholas Hawksmoor, who had been Sir Christopher Wren's assistant. What he did in London was well established. What was less clear was why he had bothered. About 15 years ago I was teaching at Christ Church Primary School on Brick Lane, a Church of England school full of Muslim kids. I asked Margaret Hewson, who had worked at the school for 35 years, why the school that was 100% Muslim was connected to the Church of England, why these poor kids were having to sing hymns in assembly and hear parables about Jesus when they were all Muslims. Marge told me about a tunnel that ran between the school and a church about 100 yards away on Commercial Street, Hawksmoor's Christ Church, Spitalfields. The school and the church were linked historically and architecturally. It dawned on me that this school was connected to one of the best novels I'd ever read. Peter Ackroyd's Hawksmoor features a crypto-satanic architect who builds a series of churches to cast some kind of spell on London. If you don't know his work, Ackroyd's London the Biography is the best book about this city. His Histories of England series offer frank insight into the development of this country, and his Albion, the Origins of English Imagination, traces the evolution of the English written tradition. In his novel Hawksmoor, Ackroyd had an architect build a labyrinth to last 1,000 years beneath Christ Church, Spitalfield, and I knew there was a tunnel right where Ackroyd had said it was. As I stood on the corner of Brick Lane and Fournier Street with Marge, I felt an overwhelming urge to go full Indiana Jones and try and investigate. I asked Andy, the rector of Christ Church, if I could go down the tunnel and mention Ackroyd's book. This clearly hit a nerve with him. He said the church had no time for idle conspiracy theories in a way that felt well rehearsed. Hawksmoor's churches also feature in From Hell, Alan Moore's genius rendition of the Jack the Ripper murders. The parish council clearly had enough of Hawksmoor enthusiasts bothering them with their strange theories. The idea of a tunnel fascinated me, but I couldn't see any way to get down there except by breaking in, which something I didn't feel I should do. A few months later, a friend suggested it might make a good documentary, and if I did some more research, maybe he could help me get it made. Now, 15 years later, that idle chatter over beer has somehow never materialised. But I did do some research. In my own terms, I went full Indiana Jones and I read some books. Kerry Downes' Hawksmoor and Vaughan Hart's Nicholas Hawksmoor are serious and somewhat sesquipedalian architectural histories of the real man's work. Born in 1661, he had an amazing career, plucked out of obscurity at 17. He became Sir Christopher Wren's assistant during the rebuilding of St Paul's Cathedral after the Great Fire. Aged 46, his supporters in Parliament passed a bill that enabled him to build his London churches. He was a generation younger and a social class lower than Wren, and Hawksmoor had long remained in his master's shadow. There had never been a better time to be an English architect. As well as building in London, Hawksmoor worked at Blenheim Palace and Castle Howard, two of the most famous great houses in England. His most famous work being his last of the towers of Westminster Abbey. When it came to Hawksmoor's London churches, I was looking for references to their locations, and this had been the theme in both Ackroyd's novel and From Hell. Where the churches were located was important in the fictional accounts, and as it turned out, it mattered to the real Hawksmoor too. Ackroyd and others call this psychogeography. For example, Hawksmoor had spent months trying to acquire a piece of land in Wapping, about 100 yards to the west of where the church he built now stands. He tried persuasion, offered a very good price, but was refused. His supporters in the aristocracy tried to flex their muscles and force a sale, but this too failed. Why did this matter? Intriguingly, the factual books I read about Hawksmoor describe his churches as best understood of a piece, and that they were sermons in stone. Together, the churches tell a story. Kerry Downes, Vaughan Hart, Alan Moore and Peter Ackroyd had implied things, but none of them clearly articulated what it was, in their opinion, Hawksmoor was really trying to do. I knew Hawksmoor had built 6 churches and helped design the spires of 2 more. I opened up Google Earth and plotted them. Of the churches shown on the map, Hawksmoor designed and built 6 by himself, and the 7th, St John Horsley Down, he built with his apprentice John James. St John's was badly damaged by repeated bombings and pulled down after World War II. All the other churches remain more or less intact. This distribution of churches is what the poet Ian Sinclair called the shape of fear in his epic poem Lud's Heat. It was Sinclair's insight that inspired Alan Moore to feature Hawksmoor's work in From Hell. Ackroyd took Sinclair's idea and ran away with it in his novel Hawksmoor. What was so inspiring about this strange game of dot to dot? The 4 churches in the middle make a kind of tilted square. If the church in Wapping had been built about 100 yards to the west, as Hawksmoor had wanted, the distance between the 4 churches, the 4 sides of the square, would have been equal within a few yards. But why would he bother doing this? My answer to this question, and my theory, this whole story, is that Hawksmoor built his churches to achieve something greater than the sum of its parts. Getting my head around this was literally psychedelic for me. It expanded my mind, my understanding of London, architecture, religion, history, politics and Freemasonry. Some claim the distribution of Hawksmoor's churches are just random, that any pattern is purely in the eye of the beholder. But there is a simple demonstration that this cannot have been the case, and that for whatever reason, the placement of his churches was deeply important to him. This photo is taken from the top of Greenwich Hill and overlooks the Naval Hospital that Hawksmoor helped Wren design and build. The whole complex is built on a line of symmetry, and if you follow that line of symmetry north to just underneath where that arrow is pointing, you can just about make out the spire of St Anne's Limehouse that Hawksmoor had built exactly on the line of symmetry of Greenwich Hospital, over the Isle of Dogs, over a mile away. That view is no longer there because Canary Wharf was built in the 80s, but from this it is evident, self-evident, Hawksmoor cared deeply about the placement of his churches. He put the spire of his tallest church directly on the line of symmetry of Greenwich Hospital. So I'm now going to skip forward to chapter 5 and read you something from there. Every child in England learns that in 1666 a fire started on Saturday night in a baker's shop on Pudding Lane, accidentally burning down the city. What is weird about reading accounts from the time is that no one in London believed that. Edward Hyde, the Lord Chancellor, reported to the King but by the Monday that while the fire was still raging, there was a universal conclusion that this fire came not by chance. Everyone agreed it was deliberate. Before I had read what Hyde had said to the King, I'd seen an inscription on Wren and Hook's massive monument to the fire. The inscription details the fire, but it's really the last sentence that's relevant to us. It says, "The popish frenzy which wrought such horrors is not yet quenched." This last sentence was added in 1681 and then removed in 1830. So in 1681 the official monument to the Great Fire was blaming the Catholics for starting it. And this accusation was carved in stone but later removed. So the official version of the Great Fire changed. How and why did this happen? How is it we are never taught at school that it was the universal conclusion of Londoners at the time that the fire was not an accident? How was it that this popish frenzy of fanatical Catholicism, blamed for starting the fire, had been quietly removed from history? The vilification of Catholicism, especially since the Gunpowder Plot of 1605, had become state policy. Catholics lived under draconian laws restricting their movement, their ability to practice certain professions, and their beliefs were taxed. In these circumstances, it would have been easy to understand if Londoners had believed Catholics were behind the fire. Funny thing was, they didn't believe that either. The prevailing conspiracy theory at the time of the fire was it was the Dutch, their fellow Protestants, who had started it. But to understand this, we need to stop looking at the fire for a moment and take a step back and look at the war. The First Anglo-Dutch War was between 1652 and 1654 and was waged under Cromwell. The dynamic was basically either London or Amsterdam would become the new Venice and dominate global trade. The question was which, for the bankers, was the better bet. It all rested on the ability to command the sea. The Second and Third Anglo-Dutch Wars were both disastrous for England, nearly destroying their trade and crippling the whole urban economy. Both wars were started by the actions of the same man, the Stuart brothers' long-term friend, Captain Robert Holmes. Captain Holmes was one of the elite group of royalists who had joined the Stuart brothers in their French exile. As such, it was not surprising he was instrumental in fulfilling Charles II's obligation to his cousin, Louis XIV of France, to start a war with the Dutch. In 1664, Holmes sailed a flotilla of ships belonging to James's Royal African Company to Guinea, where, so the story went, there was a mountain of gold. Perhaps unsurprisingly, that mountain never appeared, but Holmes persuaded the crew he had tricked onto the voyage that they may as well engage nearby Dutch settlements and take their fortresses. This incident instigated the Second Anglo-Dutch War, and the prize for the victory was domination over the spice trade. Spices were desirable and profitable, but one spice in particular was an absolute necessity for those in the know. To understand this, we need to step back from the war and look at disease. The bubonic plague had decimated Europe infamously in the 14th century, and in sporadic pockets ever since. It had killed millions over the centuries. Outbreaks were still common, especially among the poor. Of all the medicines then known, nutmeg was the only effective defence against the plague. The same chemical mixture that makes nutmeg slightly psychoactive also makes fleas flee. Insects hate it. Nutmeg does, irrefutably, offer you effective immunity to plague because fleas will not bite you. It was remarkable good fortune on the part of the Royal Navy that they stole so much nutmeg from the Dutch the year before the Great Plague hit London in 1665, meaning they, the Royal Circle and the Royal Navy Circle, who had orchestrated this theft of nutmeg, would have been safe. The treaty that ended the Second War in 1667 included England giving up its Spice Island, swapping it for Manhattan, which the Dutch had called New Amsterdam, but James Stuart renamed New York after himself as Duke of York. Some people today laugh at the Dutch for giving up New York for nutmeg, but that's because we never see anyone dying of bubonic plague anymore. Later on, in 1672, having been demoted, vilified and then restored to office by James, now in command of his own squadron of ships in Portsmouth, Robert Holmes launched an unprovoked attack on the Dutch Smyrna convoy, known for its expensive cargo. This started the later Third Anglo-Dutch War. So it's fair to say Robert Holmes had form. He didn't like the Dutch, and I dare say they didn't like him. This antagonism between the English and the Dutch, which was nurtured by Louis XIV of France over control of the maritime trade generally, and nutmeg in particular, resulted in many casualties on both sides, all Protestants. Now, returning to the year of the fire, perhaps the most famous event of the Second Anglo-Dutch War was what became known as Holmes' Bonfire. On the 19th of August 1666, Holmes attacked a Dutch port, destroyed 140 merchant vessels and set fire to the town of West Terschelling, killing about 100 people. It was a devastating, destructive raid on a soft-sitting target. The Dutch were outraged at an attack on a civilian town, but back in England, Holmes was a hero. With this attack still in Londoners' minds, the Second War with the Dutch was all the news when the fire started. Charles II had started the war with the Dutch and driven a wedge between two Protestant naval powers that enabled the French to press more vigorously on land. To repeat something that's hard to believe and is mentioned early in the book, but is uncontested history, Charles agreed to convert England back to Catholicism and took money from King Louis XIV on a regular basis. The Stuarts' Dutch wars were part geopolitical and religious manoeuvring and part profiteering. As the fire raged, the story went about that the Dutch, in revenge for Holmes' bonfire, had been the ones who'd set fire to the city of London. Some said it was a Dutchman who owned the baker's shop in Pudding Lane, where the fire had started, and what was already a pretty xenophobic city, it soon became dangerous for foreigners on the streets. People with accents became victims of frenzy. Amidst the smoke and flames, some foreigners were beaten, mutilated and killed. London was, at that time, a tinderbox waiting to ignite. The year 1666 had long fascinated the superstitious, with all kinds of prophecies and prognostications being made. For example, many found deep significance in the fact that 1666, in Roman numerals, uses every numerical sign, that is M, D, C, L, X, V, I, in order. These artefacts of the imagination were, it seems, given some kind of royal sanction. Samuel Pepys reports that Prince Rupert referred to the predictions made by Mother Shipton about London burning. Mother Shipton was a prophetess who died over 100 years previously, ever since people had been putting words into her mouth, and she became a popular figure on the penny sheets, which were about as reliable as Fox News. In the run-up to 1666, this kind of story may well have been put about to soften people up psychologically before the main event. Indeed, during the fire, doom-mongers were found everywhere, claiming the fire was God's judgment, that London was Babylon, and Babylon must burn. It seems some people were so busy telling everyone else, "I told you so," they forgot to help put out the fire, and then even enjoyed the carnage. The previous year, at least 100,000 people in London, all too poor to buy nutmeg, had died of the plague. The poet John Dryden called 1666 a year of miracles. It was all too much for some people. They turned to God to explain the inexplicable. In Parliament, the fire was called the justice of God, the wrath of God. Samuel Pepys suffered from what we now call post-traumatic stress and couldn't sleep well for months, being plagued by dreams of fire. Then I want to give you a quote now from the MP and poet Andrew Marvell, who wrote, "War, plague and fire all against us conspire. We the war, God the plague, but who raised the fire?" Again and again you read the same sort of thing from people around at the time. Who raised the fire? People were absolutely certain it wasn't natural. People at the time were sure about it. The fire had not been an accident. The rumours that Dutchmen had started it were soon superseded by events. It is possible that Charles and James Stuart had wanted to use the Dutch narrative to deepen the divide between England and Holland. It would have suited their long-term plans for returning England to Catholicism. But there was very little supporting evidence for the Dutch theory, and what evidence there is points clearly to arsonists having royal and French connections. This is all detailed by the committee set up by Parliament to investigate the fire. Their true and faithful account includes quotes such as these. "In the time of the fire, a constable took a Frenchman firing a house, seized on him, and going away to a magistrate with him, met his Royal Highness the Duke of York, who asked the reason of the tumult. One told him that a Frenchman was taken firing a house. His Highness called for the man, who spoke to him in French. The Duke asked who would attest it. The constable said, 'I took him in the act, and I will attest it.' The Duke took him into his custody and said, 'I will secure him,' but he was heard of no more." And again, on Monday the 3rd of September, there was a Frenchman taken firing a house, and upon searching him, fireballs were found about him, at which time 4 of the lifeguard rescued the Frenchman and took him away from the people, after their usual manner in the whole time of the fire. The lifeguard were King Charles II's personal protection force. The parliamentary report detailed how the king's brother and his personal protection force were rescuing arsonists. Later, Charles had the committee disbanded and prorogued Parliament so they couldn't deliver their findings to Parliament. In kind of protest at this, the committee collated their results and printed their report. King Charles then said it was illegal to own a copy of this report and had copies of the parliamentary inquiry into the fire burnt. This is the opening page of the report, and as you can see, it states that the fire began at a Farriner's house in a baker's on Pudding Lane. This was written on the 18th of September by William Goldsborough, who was the clerk to the Parliament. What was interesting about this is the conclusion of the report was written before the committee had even met. In other words, someone had decided what had happened before MPs had had a chance to investigate. This made the clerk, Williams Goldbrother, sufficiently suspicious that he shared this information with the Court of Common Council in the City of London. And we can see in their records that on the 18th of September 1666 he went to the Court of Common Council, and they said what he did was sufficiently valuable to them to pay him £25 in gold for services done and to be done. Some people try and dismiss the parliamentary report and its contents, but that can't explain why in 1679 Charles II had a reprint done of an edited version of the report which took out all the mentions of arson. Why would he bother to do that? 13 years after the original report, Charles II had a redacted report distributed. Again in 1689, after the Glorious Revolution, and James II, who was mentioned in the parliamentary report as rescuing arsonists, James II had been kicked off the throne. The original report was reprinted, perhaps in part to justify the Glorious Revolution and the removal of James II as king. It's worth pointing out that towards the end of Charles II's reign, there was no functioning City of London nor Parliament, both the principal institutions that had defeated his father and his royal court in these civil wars. He had effectively disbanded. In March 1681 he called Parliament to Oxford, which was fairly unusual, and there he dismissed them. He said, return to your manor houses, return to your country seats. I don't need you anymore, I won't be calling you anymore. Now that's because he was able to do that when Parliament had traditionally been his supply of money. He'd made a deal with his cousin Louis. The secret treaty of Dover in 1670 basically made Charles II, the King of England, an employee of Louis XIV, the King of France, and as a result of that income, Charles no longer needed Parliament, so he disbanded them. Having done so, he then turned to the City of London, the most powerful institution in the country, and said, quo warranto, where do you get your authority from? Now he used his lawyers to basically undermine the privileges of the City of London, and he effectively removed all of their privileges. They were no longer able to appoint their own officials. They came under royal power in a way that they had never done before. Now, this was all restored after the Glorious Revolution of 1688, but the antagonism between the Lion and the Unicorns, between the Whigs and the Tories, between the City and the Stuart Crown was the backdrop to Hawksmoor's whole upbringing and life. So my book tries to pull this together. It is an incredible period of history that we do not get taught properly. And Hawksmoor's churches, and investigating them and investigating the people around him and the thinking and the planning they were doing, led me down a deep, deep rabbit hole that led me ultimately to the parliamentary report into the Fire of London. The book culminates with my suggestion for what Hawksmoor was trying to do with the distribution of his churches, and I'd ask you to read that in there. So once again, I'd like to thank Watkins for having me this evening. I guess we're now going to questions.